who, Johnny, I had the good fortune to have Johnny as a master's student back in 2009, 2008 to 2010. And he was instrumental in some very ambitious projects we undertook, which involved building houses and taking them to things like the International Solar Decathlon and showcasing them at the Olympics and doing all sorts of things that academics don't normally get to do. And it was largely due to a lot of Johnny's efforts. So I tried very hard to persuade him to do a PhD, but he wanted to go off in the world and make an impact, and he's certainly done that. And that's what he's going to talk about today. So happy to have you here, Johnny, and I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thanks so much, Lynn. Thanks for having me, and thanks, Kate. Hi, everybody. It's really nice to be here. I used to be sitting in those seats not so long ago. I haven't been back since, so it's pretty cool to be here for me. When Lynn asked me to come speak, I asked her why, because the speaker series was all about, looking into the research that people were doing, and I haven't done any research since I left school. But she thought it would be interesting for folks to hear from somebody who chose to go into industry and maybe learn something about my experiences and the career path that I chose. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm also just always happy to answer questions or chat with folks afterward. I can stay for a little while, so please don't be shy.
Just to note that there will be a little reception with some pizza and drinks afterwards in Studio B for those who are present.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to give just a really quick background about myself, talk through my time in grad school, and reflect a bit on the work that Lynn mentioned and sort of how I perceive it now, sort of 15 years on. Then I'll talk about choosing to go into industry and the experiences that I've had in the software and tech world, and then try and pull that together into some notes that hopefully might be useful to you in thinking about your own next steps and what you want to do with your career and your life after your grad studies. Are you guys all grad students or? Yeah, okay. And finally, hopefully we'll have lots of time for Q&A. So this is my family. This is my wife, Jess, who's a school teacher, and my kids, Jack and James. This is in Tofino, which is where I first lived when I moved to BC in 2003, and is still one of my favorite places. So I grew up in Southern Ontario, and I went to do my undergrad at my master in Hamilton. I took a humanities degree. When I was in high school, I really liked drawing and illustration, so I thought I want to be an illustrator. So I went to university and tried to take graphic design courses and that kind of stuff. But at the time, sort of this is like 99, 2000, multimedia and putting interactive stuff on the web was new. So this is definitely dating myself, but this is before smartphones and social media. This is before sort of like richly interactive websites. This is when if you wanted to do some cool stuff online, you basically had to build like a little Flash applet, and that would allow you to do like an animation or some sort of a game. And in studying that stuff, I learned to program. And I realized, having come from like being interested in design and drawing, that actually what I was most interested in was programming. And at the time, it was very easy to pick up new technologies because everybody was sharing on the web about how to do these things. So I did my undergrad there, and then I went on and started my own web development agency. And I ran that through my 20s, and that allowed my wife and I, who was then my girlfriend, to sort of travel around the world, and she continued her own studies. And so I sort of did the sole proprietor entrepreneur thing for a while. Eventually, I sort of like reached the limit that I could, of amount of money I could make doing it as a sole proprietorship. I either had to start hiring people and taking on more clients or changing how I was going about the business. And I didn't really want to do any of that stuff. I just liked building things directly for clients. So I decided to come back to school and level up my my education to see what might be next. And I chose, oops, I didn't go forward there. I chose SIAT for its mix of humanities and science courses. So I'm not sure exactly the structure of it now, but at the time you could come and take a sort of mixed curriculum and sort of emphasize the arts side of it and get an MA, or the science side and get a Master's of Science. And I chose to do the science route, but I loved that there was a real mix of courses. I could take data viz from Lynn and AI from Steve DiPaola and try all sorts of different things here at the school. And this allowed me also to move back to Vancouver, and I fell in love with the West Coast and have never left since. So as Lynn mentioned, when I joined, I really wanted to work on something in energy and climate. Sort of really passionate about environmental work, and I wanted to see if there was something that I could work on that would sort of contribute to that. And before I started, there was a team that had joined Ryerson and Waterloo and SFU building an entry to the Solar Decathlon, which is this contest that the Department of Energy in the States runs. So they invite teams from around North America to come to the Washington Mall and build like a solar powered net zero home and compete on measures of efficiency, livability, and affordability. So there was this great project going on that Lynn was involved with, and so I asked if I could get involved. So we built North House, this beautiful sort of solar sheathed home that was able to have a net zero energy footprint in an Ontario winter climate. And we took it to the competition in DC, and we did really well. We came 4th out of 20, and I got to work with lots of other great grad students along the way. So my job was working on designing and building these panels, which were sort of a combination of control systems for the house, so adjusting lights and sliders and all this sort of different subsystems of the house, and then also building tools for feedback on energy and water usage in the homes. So these could also show graphs and other graphics to give feedback, and we had this sort of interesting ambient backsplash display that could like change color and shape depending on how the occupant of the house was using energy and water. And really the goal was to understand how to help the occupants of a home like this understand their influence of the influence of their behaviors on resource consumption. So we had this model. I'm sure you've seen a version of this before, from data up to wisdom, sort of ratcheting up to help people make decisions based on information. And we had that same idea, but for sort of influencing somebody's resource footprint. So the idea that you start with basic feedback, like, oh, you're using a lot of energy or water right now. That maybe builds up awareness of how that relates to their behaviors, maybe influences their attitude, and eventually changes their habits. So they would ideally be, using their resources in sort of an optimal way. We built a whole bunch of different screens for the web and for the panels in the homes, and ran a bunch of different types of studies to try and understand how people could interpret that information. And implemented in a working system in the house, including an early web app for iPhone. This was just before the native SDK came out for iPhone. So it was a lot of fun building those things out and trying to make the technology work, interfacing with all these fairly complex house systems, and doing it with the intention that it could actually be used by an occupant in the home. It wasn't just slideware or just sort of a demo, like it actually worked, and you could touch and see how it interacted with the house. It was cool. So a model that we were using at the time, the Toyota Prius had this image in its like little heads-up display. It was the first sort of commercially available hybrid, and it would give the driver feedback on how their driving was impacting their mileage. Because when you were braking, it was regenerating the batteries, and you could actually see that in real time. And this was like a really big deal for people, 20 years ago. And it led to the invention of the sort of hypermiling community of people who could get their Priuses to go like just ridiculous distances by being super careful about how they were driving and trying to get as much regen as they could. And 20 years later, I have an EV now, and it has like, kind of just like a higher res version of the same thing. It shows me which wheels are regenerating as I go down hills and that kind of stuff, and which types of drive modes and like height of the truck and stuff will influence how far it will go. And it's actually kind of I bring it up as an example because this model here, the goal is that, after you give people feedback on how they're using the resources, over time it will ratchet up into sort of like an embodied understanding of how the system works. You shouldn't have to be looking at the screen all the time, especially when you're driving, but you do want to get a sense of like, different decisions that you're making and their influence on it. And that's actually what happens with these kinds of driving systems when they're done well. You get an internal sense of it over time, and you just change your driving behavior because you don't want to be having to stop to charge. So the Olympics came to Vancouver in 2010. It was super fun. At the time, the city was working on infill housing to try and increase urban density. And one of the things that they had come up with was laneway houses, so that people could take an existing plot of land with a house on it and put an extra house on the back for people to live in. So we did it all over again at the Olympics. We built another one of these ambient background displays for water usage in the house, and then we had similar kinds of like a data portal online that the occupant of the house could look at to understand how much energy they was using. Some of this stuff was more proof of concept than anything, but it was fun to show at the Olympics. So at this point, I got into hardware hacking. Like, so that had been sort of like primarily software work, and the teams at our like commercial vendors and the other schools that were in the solar decathlon were doing more of the hardware. But I was really interested in hardware, so started learning microelectronics, building some network connected point of use energy monitors. A big problem with giving feedback to somebody about how much energy they're using is that often the buckets are too big. It's like, okay, your house is using so many kilowatt hours, but like, how can you actually change that? Like, where's that actually coming from? So I got more interested in getting more granular to the level of like these individual outlets or subsystems in the house to try and give feedback to folks. This project was the same kind of idea, but for water. I hacked together a little thing that could go in line in your shower head and show you how much water you were using, and then sort of like keep a streak over time so you could like try and improve your water usage. It was fun to build these, you know, we were doing field studies, so building these microelectronics, putting these in these little Pelican cases that were waterproof, and then putting them in the field, and like half the studies it would just break. So it's just like a constant pain in the butt, but I got better at soldering along the way and figured out how some of this stuff works. And in the end, I sort of realized that probably something simple like this is better, like a 5-minute shower timer from the dollar store probably does the same job that a complicated piece of electronics does. Anyway, just wrapping up on my thesis work, this all culminated in a handful of articles that Lynn and I published in a few journals that are focused on sort of energy and visualization. And in my thesis, which was on ambient and artistic resource viz, which was sort of a lit review of the state of the art at the time, and then the results of a mixed method study on a few energy monitors that I built. So today I live in a solar powered grid tied home, and these are the interfaces that I get. So it's somewhat cool that like the stuff that we were doing back then is now what's sort of mainstream now. It's also kind of depressing that it hasn't come any farther than this. The BC Hydro one is essentially the same as what we had at the time. You know, Nest, I think, is like a cool idea in practice. I don't know that it works all that well. And this is like the feedback from the solar panels, which basically tells me when it's sunny, I make more energy. Not much more than that. And I haven't seen any of the ambient and artistic kind of feedback become mainstream. There's cool art projects, and there's a few like commercial scale, like urban projects, like urban art projects that are pretty cool. But the stuff that we were working on at the time hasn't really kind of percolated to the mainstream 15 years later. Lynn and I were just having coffee and we were chatting about this. And I think broadly speaking, what I've taken away from the research we did at the time, but with, you know, 15 years removed, is that, you know, at the time, focusing on people's consumption and sort of the end of pipe usage of energy and water was what felt tractable. It's the thing that we could work on and try and make an influence on. And there was a lot of discussion at the time about conservation being, you know, a great way to fight, you know, increasing use of energy and fossil fuels. But now, you know, with more experience and seeing how things have evolved since then, the sort of consumption piece is kind of a small piece of the pie. Really, it's the big hard problems of electrification and grid scale renewables and, you know, retrofitting the built environment to be more efficient with things like heat pumps and elimination of gas that are really going to make the biggest difference in sort of transitioning over and having the just transition to a more renewable energy economy. Unfortunately, this is slow and it's more of a policy thing, and it's not so much about, you know, building full products at the end of the line. So switching gears a little bit, a bit of a tangent based on that hindsight analysis. I came across this great thread on Twitter the other day. I won't show the whole thing here, but this is sort of the crux of it. Crawford is getting at the idea that academia is preoccupied with new ideas. Academia cares whether an idea is new. It doesn't really have to work. Industry only really cares if an idea works. It doesn't matter if it's new. It's just if there's a business that you can build around it. And he talks about the gaps that you get from that distinction between academia and industry. So he uses this graphic to highlight those gaps between sort of scientific endeavors, pure research on the left, and sort of business scale, successful companies on the right. He talks about the so-called valley of death of invention in the middle, which is where promising ideas often go to die, and which every invention has to go through before it can become a successful business. So, 20 years ago, machine learning and novel AI methods were very much in the realm of scientific inquiry. And then it has been, a process of different people trying to find applications to the point where now ML is, in a lot of different things at scale, and AI is becoming, a hugely successful and widely distributed set of technologies. Something like quantum computing is still sort of in like this, but does it work phase? There's a lot of companies here in Vancouver trying to make quantum computing scalable and workable, but it's not totally clear yet when it will kind of exit into a distribution phase. The reason I bring this up is because I realized in the course of my studies that I was actually way more interested in those questions than I was in the sort of pure scientific inquiry questions. Research was fine, and I wrote my papers and I wrote my thesis and stuff, but it wasn't really what like got me up in the morning. Nor did I like the sort of academic side of grant writing and all that kind of stuff. What I really wanted to do was figure out how to make technology work for people. So that's a brief recap of my master's research and sort of like a turning point for me, which was, like Lynn said, there was an option to sort of continue on into the PhD program, which was, an amazing opportunity because I really liked the school and I liked the people I was working with. But one, I needed money to keep living in Vancouver. And two, like I said, I was less drawn to the research and I was more drawn to spending time building things. So I left school after defending my thesis, and I was hoping to work in hardware and energy. I had done an internship at BC Hydro as part of our work on the houses, but there weren't any jobs at the time. This was still like the economic recession after the 2008 financial crisis, so there was not a lot of jobs coming out of school, but I could code, so I looked for jobs in software. So I got an entry-level job at SAP, which you've maybe seen like signs on like billboards or the F1 ads or something. It's a giant German software company. They make systems of record for other giant companies. So for example, the App Store and iTunes and the Apple Store all still run on SAP subsystems. I joined a small Vancouver-based team with a bunch of people I really liked and who I've remained friends with. But the company was, really big, tens of thousands of people. It's too corporate for me, and I couldn't really say what the company did. Like my mom would be like, "Well, what does SAP do?" I don't know. They make software. So I left after about a year. It just really wasn't for me. But it did allow me to pay off some of my grad school debt and sort of get my feet under me. And I realized I wanted to work on a much smaller team and on something that I cared about and could get my hands around. So at that point, Stuart Butterfield and the other folks who founded Flickr, which is a photo sharing site. Are people familiar with Flickr? Yeah, maybe not so many. It was like a big deal 20 years ago when they were the first people to sort of make it easy to put photos up online. This was before Facebook and stuff. And it's 4 people, including Stuart, who's from Lund, BC, at the end of the Sunshine Coast. They had started a new company. They built Flickr, they sold it to Yahoo, worked in the Valley for a few years, and then they came home and they started a new company called Tiny Speck. And funnily enough, it happened to be like the next door down in Yaletown from the big SAP building. And I'd been a Flickr user for years, putting up my photos on there. And I had learned a lot about what I knew about web development, from 2 of the other founders. Cal Henderson had written like an O'Reilly book called Web Scale or something like that, that I had read and enjoyed. And Eric Costello, one of the other founders, he kept a blog where he wrote about like early HTML and CSS techniques, which I had learned a lot from. So I thought, wow, it'd be so awesome to go and work with these guys directly. So I applied, went for coffee, got the job, and started working on this game called Glitch. So it was a small, sort of weird game. It was a massively multiplayer online role-playing game. It was really quirky and creative. you could milk the butterflies in the game, or if you pet the pigs, you would get like bacon points. It was like sort of psychedelic and interesting. And the people who played it absolutely loved it. It was kind of like Animal Crossing for people who are into video games. But it was expensive to make, and we didn't have nearly enough people playing it. We had like 20,000 sort of like consistent players, but we were just like hemorrhaging money. So it was a great company culture and a really fun product to work on, but the business sucked. So eventually Stuart decided to shut the game down and lay off most of the company staff. And to my great luck, he asked me to stay on, and we pivoted to what would become Slack. So we went from 45 people working on the game to 8 of us, including the 4 founders, working on turning some of our internal tools into a product. And Slack was the code name, and then it stuck and became what we launched with. Now, I'm not going to go in depth on the Slack story, but suffice to say, it was like a good business, great company to work for, and we were able to sort of grow it successfully over time. Have folks used Slack? A few more nods? Okay, that's good. So my role was leading the front-end engineering team and the product design of the clients on desktop and mobile. Here's what we launched with in 2014. Then in 2020, between 2014 and 2020, we went from 8 of us working on it to 3,000 people working on it, and from teams of a couple hundred using it to the biggest companies in the world using it, like Amazon and IBM, with sometimes up to 1 million people. And finally, this is the latest design that we introduced last year, and this was the last thing I worked on before I left in June 2023, a little less than a year ago, after 11 years at the company. We got big enough that we took the company public in 2019, which was like a super cool career highlight. We got to go to the stock exchange and ring the bell and do all the things. And then, oh, no, hang on. So it was a really fascinating product to work on. Like Glitch, Slack is basically like an online role-playing game. It's just one you play with your colleagues instead of your friends. This diagram shows the connections between people in a social network. So in Slack, this was one-to-one and group DMs and the channels that people join in a workspace. And it doesn't take many people to start to get really complicated, especially when you're starting to build something for tens of thousands of internationally distributed people. And ultimately, Slack was a product about helping people communicate and work better together. And that's an interesting and ever-evolving problem that'll never really be fully solved, which was why it was sort of endlessly fun to work on and adapt as people's expectations changed. Because we were really moving people over from email. Like 15 years ago, if you went to work, you would communicate most of the time by email for most roles. And we sort of shifted that over to real-time chat. I really love my time at the company. And then a couple of years ago, Salesforce, after we went public, bought us for $28 billion. And the company was really big and really corporate, and I didn't really know what they did. And so I left after about a year. So what? That's just a bunch of stuff that happened to one person. I don't know if there's too many sort of lessons you can draw from any one person's career. And I'm also not in the habit of sort of giving people directive advice about careers. Sometimes people have questions, but I think the unique sort of opportunities and constraints for each person are so different that it's very hard to give generic career advice. But I did want to share some questions that have been useful to me in determining sort of what I want to do next at each sort of fork in the road. And I hope that they would be useful to you in considering your own options. So this first question, who do you want to spend your time with? I found that following people, like in my case, choosing to work with the specific people who started Flickr and had started something new, that's a pretty durable way to make good choices. It can also be less about individual people and more about like tribes of people. Like I like spending my time with makers or philosophers or educators or whatever. Ultimately, a career is made up of the sort of many hours and days you're going to spend at work. And who you choose to spend those days and hours with will have a big impact on your perspective, your opportunities, and on your well-being. So you should choose wisely. I think often career advice is given in the vein of like, what do you want to be? like a specific title or role, or how much money do you want to make, or something like that. But those are sort of like, those are actually less important than choosing who you want to spend your time with and what you want to spend your time doing. This graph from Our World in Data shows who you spend time with on a day-to-day basis over the course of your life. So from being a kid to old age, and this dark green line is time with your colleagues. So it's the third highest after time alone and time with your partner, if you have a partner. So you should choose wisely who you spend that time with, because it's gonna have a huge impact on what your life looks like. So then what do you want to spend your time doing? So this is also like, you know, the sort of like primary school class, like what do you want to be when you grow up? And it's like, I want to be a doctor or a fireman or something like that. It's less about that, and it's more what do you want your day-to-day work to actually look like? So I think people often make decisions about their career based on their sort of perception of what something is about. So somebody maybe wants to influence policy, so they become a politician. But actually being a politician is, I think, a pretty crappy day-to-day job. A lot of the actual stuff you have to do is pretty awful. So it's worth really thinking about, what does the day-to-day of, you know, a professor look like, or a plumber, or a software engineer, or designer, or an animator, and think about sort of where on the spectrum from theory to practice do you like to spend your time? Do you want to spend your time reading and thinking, talking to others, making things with your hands or on computers? Do you want to spend it outside in nature, traveling, meeting new people? And then choose a career accordingly. For me, the answer was that I always gravitated toward programming computers and building tools for people. And I've been really lucky to spend most of my working career doing those things. Also, I remember sitting in your seat and being like really like anxious about what was next and how I was going to try and make a career for myself and pay off my bills. And it's worth remembering also that what you choose next, or any career that you go into, it's never just one thing. You don't have to pick a lane and stay in it, and you're not going to have the same job for 50 years. You can sort of follow your curiosity and plant seeds and see what grows over time, and sort of build up your own garden of interests. And the people who I know who are closer to my age, the ones who are often happiest and most fulfilled, have changed jobs and done a lot of different things. My friend Lindsay, she was like a structural engineer, and she was successful, and she was like late 20s making good money, and she's like, I hate this. And she went back to school and retrained as a nurse, and now she delivers babies all day, and she's like the happiest person I know and doing something really important. So you just never know where your life's going to take you. Oh, that was my nice graphic about my garden metaphor. I didn't switch fast enough. So finally, what layer do you want to work on? Layer. You guys seen this picture before? This is from Stuart Brand, who was a creator of the Whole Earth catalog in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and just like a really great thinker on technology and human culture and philosophy. Anyway, he says, in a durable society, each level is allowed to operate at its own pace, safely sustained by the slower levels below, and kept invigorated by the livelier levels above. Each layer must respect the different pace of the others. We can examine the array layer by layer, working down from the fast and attention-getting to the slow and powerful. So, you know, the wiggly line up in the fashion layer, that's like the everyday new trends in music and social media and memes and that kind of stuff. And then in commerce, new ideas come along quite frequently, and there's sort of constant turnover, like the new car models every year. Infrastructure comes next. It's a little slower, but still happens fairly fast. Like in a generation, think of the proliferation and plummeting cost of solar panels. 20 years ago, if you wanted to put solar panels on your house, you'd have to get a new mortgage for your house. Now you can just order them online, and it's like a few $1,000s. Governance moves slower and lags the layers above it. Think of how we're just getting around to regulations for the internet, even though it's been around for a good generation and a half now. Let alone new things like crypto and AI, which are still up in this frothy layer, and governance is slowly trying to catch up to it. Culture moves slower still, with generations clinging to older models of the world as they age. And finally, nature moves slowest of all, but all the layers above depend on it. It's a really neat model of how things work in the world. He says, note that as people get older, their interests tend to migrate to the slower parts of the continuum. Culture is invisible to adolescents, but a matter of great concern to their elders. Adolescents are obsessed with fashion, while elders are bored by it. So if you're a product designer, oh, sorry, that overlay is not very good. Can you see that green a little bit? Oh, it's invisible. There's a green box over the first 2 layers, and a product designer will sort of be preoccupied with trends and what could make a good product that will sort of survive in business. So sort of they'll be preoccupied with fashion and commerce. Civil engineer might focus on infrastructure. This is not useful without the overlays. An urban planner might need to think about culture and governance and infrastructure and commerce. And somebody who's working on climate probably needs to think about pretty well all the layers, maybe not the fashion layer. Anyway, I think about this a lot, and I've realized sort of the lower you go, the slower and harder it is to move, but the more impactful those moves are. Stuff that comes along in fashion or business, try and read like a 10-year-old magazine and like none of it seems important anymore. But there's the lower and slower layers, that's where things can really be changed over the long haul. And I think it's worth considering where your interests lie, where you think your talents and intelligence and efforts will make the biggest difference to the world you want to make and the life you want to lead, and think about how you might sort of shape your career accordingly. So lastly, a bit of actual advice that I have given to everybody who's ever sort of interned with me or that I've hired or anything like that. Something that I've learned is that in order to make a successful career, you have to be able to both do the work and be willing to talk about the work you do. So if you're all talk and no work, people are going to see through you because you're not actually creating anything of value. You're just self-promoting. If you're all work but don't know how to promote your ideas, you're a martyr and you'll be overlooked in favor of your peers or competitors that are better at articulating their value than you are. So the best and most successful people are hustlers. They can walk the walk and talk about it. So strive to be a hustler. It's a good way to get ahead. To that point, these are the 2 things that I'm working on right now. I sort of left Slack last year and I've just been sort of picking up a few projects here and there. I've been learning iOS and the Apple app ecosystem. I've built a math game for kids, mostly because my kids are learning math and it's fun to build an iPad app that they're using. And then my colleague, Ali Rail, who I started at Tiny Spec at the same time as her, she's also just left the company, and the 2 of us have been writing a newsletter at buildingslack.com, sort of sharing stories from our time. We're currently talking about sort of those early years when we were building the product and getting toward launch, but we hope to cover sort of the whole decade that we were there. So please sign up if you're interested. And with that, I'd love to take any questions or thoughts that you guys would like to share.
Thank you.
So I'm gonna hand the room over to Lynn. She's gonna moderate, and I'm going to moderate from in Zoom here. So if anyone has questions in Zoom, please you can turn your camera on or raise your hand or type into the chat. And
Let me ask you just, Johnny, can you go back to your layers of impact for a bit? One of the things that was implicit in your talk, but our students may need to know is how humans interact with technology can form a part of all of these. So could you talk a little bit about that and what you've seen in your experience, because you've hit all of it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big and fascinating question. I don't know who said it, but as a species, we're called Homo sapiens, like the thinking ape, right? But there's a lot of people who think it should be Homo techne, the technology using ape. And I think that's true. When you look at the sort of like really long now, big picture type perspectives on humanity, we spent a long time out there on the savannah and then a long time in the caves and like really not much changed. And then all of a sudden with a few technological advances, we're out there in space and we have objects that are outside of our solar system now and, potentially creating new types of intelligence with AI systems and stuff like that. So I think the short answer to your question is, how people use technology and what technology they use is sort of implicit in every one of these layers. I think, to harp on it, like climate and our mistreatment of the climate is affecting nature in a way that is going to shift everything else above it. But really all of our systems, like when I when I was growing up, the internet was sort of novel, but we didn't spend that much time on it. And so it had sort of a limited influence on my initial upbringing. But my kids today, like they've had touch screens and computers that they can talk to since they were babies. And that's just in one generation, something like as simple as like this one innovation of this type of smartphone that we all have in our pockets. It was only released 16 years ago, and has reshaped every aspect of the world of our world. I think it's everywhere, and it's about understanding sort of which chunk of it you want to work on, from that novel research through to building businesses around it, or from these sort of fun novel things down to like bigger picture changes of how we all relate to each other.
Do you have other questions? We have something in.
Hi.
Oh, sorry, I didn't.
Yeah, no worries. I just decided to put my hand up. So Johnny, I was reading about like your work or your observations on We Rise Together. And so I'm trying to decolonize this scheme a little bit in terms of relationship and Indigenous ways of knowing. And I wonder if any of your work with ecology is affecting the way you're thinking about technology.
So lately, I've been spending some time with some environmental groups, advocacy groups, Surf Rider, and nature-based solutions, and everywhere. But here in BC, there's like, in the best cases, deep integration with different Indigenous communities and how they're trying to pursue both protection of their land and ecosystems and food systems and stuff, but also, reestablishing sovereignty over these places. I would say something I'm learning about. I think a lot of the stuff around sort of, I think this phrase of two-eyed seeing, where you can approach a problem that exists in an ecosystem or something like that, both from a scientific perspective, like a Western scientific perspective of data analysis and sort of scientific study, and from an Indigenous knowledge perspective of how these natural systems have evolved over time and how they're connected to other parts of the world. So the House Island Marine Stewardship Initiative is a good example of this, I think, where they're doing a lot of stuff that would look like Discovery Channel science of taking water samples and counting cetaceans and octopuses and taking getting plastic out of the sand and all that kind of stuff. And they're partnering with the Squamish Nation and other First Nations to understand what some of these landscapes and ecosystems look like historically before colonization. So I think it's really important, and I think it doesn't take too much thinking to look at the history of colonization in BC over the last couple centuries and see how much Western ideas have thrown things out of whack after people had lived here for thousands of years without causing those problems. So yeah, I think that's like a great example of this kind of thing, and I think there's probably like Indigenous models for talking about it that would also be fruitful.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is a really interesting graphic, and thinking back to Stuart Brand, writing in the 60s and drawing this and thinking about it, and I wonder what he would have thought about artificial intelligence, and the ultimately ecologically extractive nature of AI and the tools that we're using. I wonder if that's something that you find yourself talking about with people in your industry, especially, well, AI in particular, people are starting to talk a lot about, say, like the water requirements, cooling server farms, the energy required to process our sort of playful, inquisitive text prompts is quite vast and growing. So I'm just curious to know if that's something that's
I think there's two parts there. One is you can know what Stuart Brand thinks about it because he's still writing about it, still talking about it. And I think he's like a great voice on technology because he he's an optimist in the sense that like he sees a lot of the positives in this, but he's also very philosophical and realistic about it. So he's still engaged in this and thinking about that stuff. He's part of the Long Now Institute down in San Francisco, along with Brian Eno and a bunch of other sort of like techno populist thinkers. And they have all sorts of interesting things to say about this. I think the energy question is interesting. Like I can remember getting frustrated about like when crypto was taking off and like the amount of energy it consumes, and it's just crazy stories of people like harnessing like old dead oil wells to power like crypto rigs and stuff, which is like the craziest like sort of cyberpunk thing. But I don't know. I think like our energy demands are only going to do this. Like it's a hyperbole to infinity. So to me, like the answer is to find ways to produce infinite clean energy that's widely available and cheap and durable. And I think there's a lot of good renewable solutions there, still figuring out batteries and so on. So I don't know, I guess depending on who you ask, it's either a problem to be solved, one of many, and if we solve it, it probably has so many positives for everybody, like fusion came along, for example. On the flip side, I don't know, my experience in the tech industry is there's like one arm of a company that talks about their plans for sustainability and net zero and policies around that kind of stuff, and often does real work, investing in wind farms or, upgrading their server farms to use less and that kind of stuff. But that's a separate department from the people who are actually making sort of the decisions on the business. And I think, Facebook is a good example where they have invested tens or hundreds of billions just in the last few years alone to try and be the winners of the sort of GPU race. And I don't see that slowing down. And I don't see that being a sort of central concern of the folks building those systems.
I have altogether 4 questions, so
All right.
I won't ask all of them. I
You
only
can.
ask one by one. I let other person ask other question until no one asked and asked.
Keep
one.
going.
Sounds good.
The first one, because I'm late, and then when you write it down, you're talking about distribution, and then it's about scaling. Does it mean being marketable?
This guy.
Distribution, will you scale?
Yeah.
Does it mean that will it be marketable?
I mean, this is like a simplification, right? I think there's like the, what do we know about how this stuff works? Is it true? And then does it work as both like physically, can you make a system work? And like, is there a product market fit for this thing that we have? So I don't know if you've do you remember Magic Leap? It was this like VR headset that even when I was in school, I think was like the next thing. And they had all these cool demos of like AR manipulation of things. And then like, they've been trying to make that work for like 10 years. And if you go to their website today, they have examples of it, of like surgeons, wearing their goggles, or like a, heavy machine repair or something like that. But they really haven't found a market. So they actually answered the question, does it work? And we've seen that with Meta, Oculus, or Vision Pro or whatever. Like they've made that technology work. And now it's kind of like here, which is like, can we get enough people to buy it to keep that business going? Like how many Vision Pros does Apple have to sell in order to like recoup their billions in investment? And how many industries does Magic Leap need to convince to do it this way in order to stick around? Because they're all fueled on VC money. And that's really what that's about. So it's kind of like, it's like multi-step. I think, so like the iPhone, when it came out, there was people who were famously like, it's too expensive and it's like, it's not useful enough, it's gonna flop. And then of course, there's billions of them now and we all use them. So they like got through that, but there's so many of those kinds of innovations that come along that seem really cool that just don't sort of cross that chasm. So that's really what it's about. And I guess it's like, if you're here, you're coming from an inquiry and research perspective. If you're here, you're coming from like a technologist, maybe designer perspective. And then here is more about like the business of it, which is like, how do we actually make the economics work?
Okay.
Keep going.
No one, okay. The second question is about, your schoolwork related with Simon Fraser, University. Uh, like, because the school have a different concentrations. In the bachelor degree level, they have the focus, some on design, some on the interactive system, etc. So I believe you are a graduate student wherever you get out.
Yeah.
So which area you are actually in? And I believe it's also, no matter in which, whatever the area, the person has to be very knowledgeable with working with computers.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, so like at Slack where I worked, there are people who are hired as designers, and it's like they spend their time sketching or in Figma, or creating like sort of like faked out prototypes to convey an idea that hopefully matches up with what the business is trying to do. They still have to be good at computers, like you say. Like a lot of the prototyping tools in design now are really sophisticated, like Framer, or even just like Figma prototypes can get really complicated. And then there's lots of people that we hired as engineers, and like they're coming maybe from comp sci or software development backgrounds. In my experience, maybe just because that's sort of the path that I chose, but I think practically, people who can do a bit of both are like incredibly useful, at least as glue on the team. Because sometimes you'll have somebody who has like a great idea, but they don't know how to implement it, and somebody who's maybe like really strong with programming languages or the systems that we have, but don't really have like a sense of like how people use software, or how, what parts of a design might actually be useful. And you can either put together teams where those people are side by side and they can sort of complement each other's strengths, but it is often incredibly powerful to have those skills in one person, because you're just able to do things a lot faster, and often sort of take something from an idea on a board into something that you can touch and feel and use and try more rapidly, because you just don't have to coordinate, right? So there's like I've seen different tech companies have like an actual role for that called like a design engineer or something like that. I think the companies that are doing the most interesting things, there's the most sort of like overlap in those roles. And the ones who are sort of like creating more sort of like 20th century software, it's like design makes the designs, and then like over here in another building, the engineers are building it, and they're not really talking to each other. So I don't know if that answers your question, but like I have lots of friends who went through the SIAT program, and it feels like over time people converge into some like overlap of the two, of like learning to code or learning to design, or at least understanding the constraints of each. And then, people who are able to sort of master both skill sets definitely have a lot of opportunities and autonomy in their work.
Okay. Is also an extension of the second question. In your graduate work or in the graduate program, in the topic, your topic is about software, but it appeared that to me that in the school curriculum, one probably has to be familiar with electronics as well, other than the software. Is that true that for your graduate work?
You mean like a hardware electronics?
Yeah.
I think there's tons of work that happens without any knowledge of the sort of like hardware stuff. I think for me it was just an interest, something that I wanted to do, sort of getting back to like, working with my hands and building things. It seemed like sort of back to the idea of like tribes. It's like there were folks who were just like really comfortable getting their hands dirty with like building something or 3D printing, or a lot of the like audio and music nerds are like awesome for that. They're like willing to take apart racks and put things together and like build new stuff. And then others who really just wanted to stay in their coding environment and like didn't want to deal with like the realities of the real world. I don't think there's like a positive or negative to any. I think it's just like personal interest and affinity, really. I mean, if you learn how physical systems work and how electronics work, you're just going to have that much better of an understanding of like anything that you build, how it's going to actually operate in the real world, even if it is just software. So like to me, it's just like another sort of like layer of the technology world to sort of learn about, but I don't think it's like essential by any means.
The first question is that so after you finish school, like, going into industry, what kind of, skill you think that you really need to pick up because the school do not, prepare you, well?
Yeah. Yeah, for me, the answer was just programming ability, straightforwardly. Like that's what I was able to get a job and get paid for. Maybe Lynn or Kate can speak to this better than I can, but I wasn't interested in pursuing like sort of a research-oriented job. Like those do exist at different companies and organizations, but that wasn't what I wanted to do. So I was looking for sort of like something I could get hired for with an applied skill set. Like when I did the grad school here, there was a couple classes. There was like a sort of 101 type Java programming class that I think was sort of provided as like a here's an intro type of thing. It wasn't like an in-depth course, but I think that was sort of good to get some people's feet wet. But I don't think SIAT, at least in the grad program, really focuses on building the applied skill set as much. So it's either something you're developing on your own time or that you have from previous education. And this is also sort of the gap between like colleges and technical institutes and research universities like SFU. And I think like it's really interesting how it's changing. Like when I was a kid, it was like, oh, you go to university and you get a good professional job. And like when my kids are making that decision in like 10 years, they're still little. I actually don't know what the right answer is going to be, like as far as like learning those skill sets. You can learn so many things online, but I do think like a lot of the colleges and applied tech institutes are probably going to give more job opportunities than a sort of more generalized like undergrad type degree. I'm speaking to the wrong audience, but that's my experience.
Okay, so,
Yeah, so thanks. Basically, I have a reverse question for you, John. So, Johnny would ask about the thing that you wish you've learned in school. So, what about the things that you learned in your undergrad and grad school that you find most useful that you can apply them in your job?
Yeah. So like what turned me on to programming in my undergrad was like I had a really good prof, Stefan Sinclair, who I was taking sort of like the sort of media art type programs, animation and that sound design and that kind of stuff. And he's like, hey, I'm teaching a class on like introduction to PHP and MySQL, which is just like 2 tools for building web apps. He's like, I think you'd really like it. And he encouraged me, and then I took it and I was like, it sort of unlocked like a whole bigger world for me because I'd only sort of used coding as like a means to an end. And then I was like, oh, this could actually be the primary thing. So I think like often if you can find somebody who sees something in you as like a mentor, that made a big difference for me. But I don't know, like I took lots of courses that have not been like applicable, but that I still have a huge, I ascribe a lot of value to. Like it was a humanities degree, so I was taking classics and I was taking film studies and I was taking like critical literature and stuff like this. And the ideas that I came out with from those and like the books that I read and the, kind of like ways of thinking that I developed, I think are probably like hugely valuable just like to being a person in the world, even if I don't have like a specific applied skill set out of it. So I don't know, maybe that's the model. Like for me, most of what I've learned in terms of being able to do things was just my own curiosity going to figure stuff out, like learning to solder and build microelectronics or learning to program a new language or something. And like the internet is amazing for that and maybe better than trying to learn it in a classroom. So yeah, there's not really, I don't think there's anything that I regret learning. And I remember taking Steve DePala's AI, is Steve still here?
Yes.
Yeah, his AI class here. And that was my first introduction to a lot of those ideas. This is like Norvig's big like green book. And this was before AI was sort of like popular in the consciousness. And like we were writing genetic algorithms and we were writing, you know, lots of different, like I can remember one of my projects in that class. I'm a hockey fan, and you know, like a guy, after he comes off the ice, there's an interviewer there, and they ask him like the same half a dozen questions, and they give basically the same 10 or so answers. You know, we're winning the little battles and putting pucks on net and all this kind of stuff. And it's just like a little algorithm in their head that's like producing these answers. So I thought it would be funny to create like a little language model that did that. This is like, you know, 2008 or whatever. And I like looked it up in the course of making this presentation. I was like, huh, that's kind of cool. It's like this very little localized LLM for hockey interviews. So it's like, you sort of get a peek around the corner. I guess that's the benefit of this stuff is like being in a research university, you're often kind of like, you're like almost a generation ahead of what like the mainstream is going to be thinking about. And that's pretty amazing.
Might also add that one of the things that we all learned when you were working with the teams was how much the engineering and the architect teams didn't know about human experience. Right? That was a real aha.
That's true. They were so preoccupied with the mechanical systems and not really thinking about how people would use them. Yeah.
Anyone else?
What do you want to read?
Go ahead.
Hi, Johnny.
Hi.
So there's a slide you're showing, you know, different layers of progress.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering that which areas or you know what layers have the most advantages, you know, here in BC. For example, if I'm into the fashion industry, I might, you know, head it to New York, Paris, or other places. Yeah, so I was wondering, so what do you think here at BC, which fields, you know, got the most support?
It's a good question. I mean, I think BC has like a pretty amazing opportunity to be a leader in some of these lower layers. And that's not to say that BC has got it all figured out, because there are a lot of very big problems. But what I mean by that is like, you know, British Columbia, you know, has such an abundance of incredible natural beauty and resources. We're mismanaging a lot of them now, but sort of trying to push it towards something more sustainable. We have like, to some extent, a progressive culture who is trying to move things forward, you know, in Vancouver in particular, but in lots of areas, you know, and you know, moving toward better models of governance. Back to your question about Indigenous groups, you know, more sovereignty and more ownership and inclusion in governance is happening. So like, I'm an optimist just generally, and I'm hopeful that BC will continue sort of moving in the right direction in those layers, so that like my kids have a richer natural environment than we have, and we're regrowing forests and taking care of the oceans and all that kind of stuff. So I think that's like an area, and I think, you know, a lot of my friends are in like environmental science or policy and working really hard on these things. There's a lot of really smart people working on stuff, both in government and in companies. So that's like sort of my hopeful answer. I mean, I think Vancouver and the sort of Lower Mainland has been trying to establish like a tech, you know, durable tech hub for a while. It still seems a little nascent. Like there are success stories for sure, like Slack. But then, you know, I talk to people who are trying to raise money or trying to hire talent, and it's really hard. There's a lot less money going around in terms of venture capital, and the rounds are way smaller, like a 10th or 100th the size. And then you try and hire somebody, and they can go down to San Francisco and get paid twice as much. So I think there's like some really tough sort of economic factors at play that maybe the government could take more of a role in. I don't know. Maybe it's just people choosing the quality of life here. Like I had a chance to move down to SF when we were working on Slack, and I chose to stay here because I just enjoy the city so much more, and there's so much else going for it, and healthcare and all the things. So, you know, we have a lot to offer, but I think right now it seems like the tech sector in Vancouver is mostly like smaller campuses from the big companies like Microsoft and Amazon and stuff, and there's lots of good jobs there. But it's not quite the same as having like a startup scene. And then sort of like the battery and quantum companies that have been happening in Vancouver, like they're still kind of at the level of potential. They haven't really broken through. So yeah, I would love it to be up here as well in commerce and infrastructure. Obviously, there's like Lululemon and Arc'teryx and all the fashion brands, which is great. Yeah, I think we're pretty well set up to build an amazing century here in BC, but we gotta keep working on it.
Anything else? Is there anyone online?
Oh, anyone online? If you could restructure, like, do you think this holds, or if you could restructure this, would you shift some of these pathways around? I'm fascinated by it. And I would almost move out commerce and infrastructure as like vehicles and move fashion closer, or the intent of fashion and creation closer,
Yeah, so I think I know what you mean. So
or centered
in
somehow.
the longer essay that this is from Stuart
Mhm.
Branch, it's worth reading. It's not like super long, but he goes into more depth about what he means. He's trying to sort of create a model of like what he sees in cultural change, and he's not just talking about our present moment. He's talking about history, like the last 10,000 years of human history. So he gives lots of examples like the French Revolution and other things where these layers do get upset. And I think like things are kind of compressing. Like unfortunately, the stuff we're doing in the top few layers is having like an incredible impact on the bottom layer really fast, faster than we've ever seen before. And he talks about the impact of something like memes, not in the like funny GIFs sense, but in the sense of like a new idea suddenly having like a dramatic impact. And like the positive, revolutions of thought that can lead to, but that also you do see the limits. So like Arab Spring as an example, like the combination of like new technology and a young generation unemployed and frustrated, sort of leading to this spark of revolution across all these countries. But then you fast forward 10 years and like it's actually things have almost maybe gotten worse, despite that like moment where a lot of these like new ideas kind of like went down and tried to like change governance structures. So his does a better job than I think I was able to do in a short presentation. But I don't think he's sort of proposing this as like a model for use. He's trying to like look at it from a historical perspective. This seems to be the way the world works. And I use it because I think it matches my own experience as well.
Okay, yes, last word, or yes.
Yeah. Okay. The last slide, appear to be of complex systems. Complex system is a system that adapting change. So, in your opinion, is the industry realizing the change, research follow, or the other way around, research realizing change, and then the industry follow?
I'm not sure I understood
Okay.
the question, I'm sorry.
Basically, like, okay, is the industry driving the change or the research driving the change?
It's definitely two-way. So I've been listening to a lot of interviews with some of the folks who have been instrumental in the research that led to the current AI wave. And a lot of them migrated from research into industry at Google mostly over the last like decade. Having worked on things like transformers for a very long time in a research space, something like all the photo recognition stuff that's in all of our apps now, like for picking out people's faces in a picture or whatever, that all came out of primary research at different media labs and stuff. So it seems to be like a two-way thing, and each is kind of lagging the other. It's like this big yo-yo. It's like you find out that you can train a computer to do all these things, and then a business springs up around that and makes a whole bunch of money, but then creates a whole bunch of new problems. Alignment as an example, and stuff that is actually a lot harder to study in pure research before it's out there in the world, because you can like theorize about like, well, what does AI alignment look like? And 20 years ago, people were asking this question, but now that it's out there in the world and people are using it, and it's doing things, it has a whole bunch of real world data and usage patterns to inform the next round of research. Okay, like what are some actual guardrails we can put on this kind of stuff? Like that's like one example, but I think it's two ways. I don't think it's ever just one driving the other. Like this picture made it look like it's this like, where was I? That's way back here. Like it's like a one-way flow, but it's a simplification. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Any other
I mean,
questions?
industry does drive research where industry is saying, here, we have a bunch of money and we want you to go do this thing and figure out how this something works. And I think that's happening all the time too. So it's almost kind of like it like loops back around.
Other questions? Looks like we've come to the end of our questions, and I'm not seeing any questions coming through Zoom. So I think that brings us to the end of our session, and please join me in thanking John for his. Thanks so much to everyone who joined us online, and we'll be ending the Zoom now. So thanks so much.